I'm pleased today to be speaking with Professor Simon Dein, who is a consultant psychiatrist with a PhD in social anthropology. And he's written extensively on religion and health among different religious communities, including Sunni Muslims and Hasidic Jews and evangelical Christians. He spoke at the last Inform seminar on health and healing in minority religions, and he has a chapter in the forthcoming Inform Routledge volume on that same topic. So welcome and thank you for joining me.
Thank you, thank you.
So to start off, could you tell us a little bit about the Lubavitcher community, which is at the centre of your chapter?
Yeah. Well, the Lubavitch are a group of Hasidic Jews. Hasidism is a ultra-Orthodox group who are led by their spiritual leader called the Rebbe. And they originated in Eastern Europe about sort of 1750s. Many of them migrated to the United States. So they live in Stamford Hill in London. There are several hundred families living there in Stamford Hill with often something like average of 8 children. The largest family I know has 18 children. Okay, so big families.
Yeah. Unlike
other Hasidic groups, there is some interaction between Lubavitch and non-Jews, mainly for business purposes. So they're not as segregated as other Hasidic groups. They speak English fluently, and unlike many other Hasidic groups, some of them were originally non-Orthodox Jews who have become more observant. And a few of them were actually not born Jewish, but converted to Judaism and then joined Lubavitch.
Can you tell us about the religious healing practices amongst this community?
Okay, so the community is led by a religious leader called the Rebbe. The Rebbe was their spiritual leader until 1994 when he died. So there is no leader now. So we're talking about almost 26 years they've been without a leader. When the Rebbe was alive and people became unwell with any degree of seriousness, they would often write to this religious leader who would ask them to check their religious artifacts. So for all Jews, they have what is called a mezuzah, which is a metal case with a parchment with prayer written on the parchment, which is attached to the right-hand doorpost of every room in the house. And often when they were unwell, the Rebbe would ask them to check this mezuzah, the parchment, because often it was erroneously written or there was a scratch in the parchment. So in fact, they thought there was a one-to-one relationship between the letters, the Hebrew writing on the parchment and their physical illness. So they had like a homology between the physical and the spiritual, between language and embodiment. Before 1994, usually people would write to the Rebbe or fax the Rebbe for a response. Some people would go to see the Rebbe live in New York, in Crown Heights in Brooklyn, and he would often give them $1, and the dollar would symbolize charity, but he would also ask them to perform some religious tasks like to wear phylacteries to fill in or check their mezuzah. So he would also help them with physical problems by attending his actual court, by talking to him there live. After he died, many followers will go to his tomb and would drop small request pieces of paper onto the tomb and receive a response. So if you're not lucky enough to be able to go to New York, and he's buried in Queens in New York, if you can't go there, you can still today in 2020 email the Rebbe's secretary, who will tear up the email and put the pieces onto his tomb, and you will receive a response. In other words, healing. And it's now even possible to directly communicate, so they believe, with the dead Rebbe through the internet. So there's a portal where you put a request into the internet site, and that supposedly will go via the Rebbe's tomb to the Rebbe, and the Rebbe will respond by a live action. A young man of 20, his mother had cancer. He was very worried she had advanced cancer. He went to visit the tomb of the Rebbe in Queens, and he dropped a piece of paper onto the tomb with a request for her healing. He flew back to London to find that her cancer had begun to respond to the chemotherapy, which he attributed to a miracle, because when these events occur, if you believe in the Rebbe, you often don't look at other logical, rational explanations.
So the Rebbe was considered a miracle worker amongst his followers?
Oh, very much so, Sarah. The Rebbe was considered not only a miracle worker, but as a Messiah as well. So for many years prior to his death, the group considered him either to be the Messiah in waiting or the actual Messiah. And when he died, many people held he would be resurrected, or some denied he had physically died. They thought he was still there but hiding in occultation. So occultation means he's hiding. And there are still groups of people 24 years later who believe he's still alive, he's not died.
Right. Do any of the healing practices relate to ideas of immortality amongst the followers, not just the Rebbe, but do any of the followers believe they can extend their life through these practices?
Well, no, it's interesting that Judaism maintains that all Jews will come back on the day of resurrection. So there's no precedent in Judaism for, obviously, for extending your life for indefinite periods. People have to die. But once you've died, you can then be resurrected. And with the Rebbe, people believed when he was alive that he would usher in the redemption, and then the resurrection of the dead would occur. But obviously it has not happened yet, if it ever will happen. But there's no precedent in Judaism for infinite lifespan.
I see. And can you say something about how illness is understood within this Lubavitcher community?
Yeah, okay, so in fact,
Thanks.
Hasidism is based on Kabbalah. And the idea is that the spiritual and physical worlds are very closely connected. And if there's disharmony in the spiritual world, that can result in disharmony in the physical world. So the physical world is a reflection of higher spiritual worlds. So in fact, their belief is that illness, although it can result from sin or neglect of a religious observance, it's often because of a higher spiritual disharmony that gives physical illness.
I see. And what about, how is the body understood within this worldview? How does this fit with modal health?
So the body is understood as a replica of the primordial man at creation. So the primordial man in Kabbalah is called Adam Kadmon. So essentially, at creation, our bodies are likened or modelled on this primordial man. Our bodies have a physical and a spiritual component, and the spiritual and physical are very closely tied together. And some people would argue that the spiritual is the lowest that the physical is the lowest manifestation of the spiritual. So, in fact, what you see is illusory, that in fact, behind the physical world, there's a much greater spiritual context or infrastructure. Mm-hmm. So the body is both physical, but a reflection of the spiritual world as well.
Can you tell us how the COVID-19 crisis has impacted this community?
Unfortunately, very badly. In America, not specifically Lubavitch, but many Hasidic Jews believe either that they're good and they can't get COVID, or that their leader, not the government, dictates what happens. So in fact, because Hasidism is a very social religion, they haven't kept to social distancing. So essentially, rates of COVID in America have been phenomenally high amongst Hasidic Jews because they won't keep to social distancing. But as far as I know, and I've researched this, I've written on it recently, unlike in Christian groups who see COVID as being apocalyptic, often based on the book of Revelation, for the Hasidim, the Hasidic Jews, there's no framework to interpret it in terms of apocalyptic or end of the world movements. They see it as a virus, but they don't believe they can catch it.
Right.
Because they're good people.
I see. Would they practice any of these healing techniques that we've discussed in relation to coronavirus?
No. Yeah, well, I don't know. I mean, I'd be very surprised if they don't still communicate with the Rebbe. I know that for all illness, still, people will email the tomb of the Rebbe or go to the tomb of the Rebbe. So it's a very good research project, Sarah, which I should do if I had the time. But I'd be surprised if they don't. In other words, I believe they would still contact the Rebbe if they became ill with COVID.
So What are you working on currently? What research are you working on, and what publications have you got?
Let me say, I'm working on how mystical ideas are used in everyday illness. In other words, you may study the Kabbalah, but does it actually impact upon your decision making and your explanation of illness? And in fact, I found recently that when people become unwell, often lay people, they don't really ask lots of deep mystical questions. They just go to the doctor. They would write to the Rebbe as well, but they're not interested in the mechanism by which religious healing works. In other words, mystical ideas are not a major framework for interpreting illness. Do you see what I'm saying?
Mm.
Yeah. So what I'm saying is that they might learn about it, but it actually impacts little on their practical life.
So thank you very much for joining me today, Professor Simon Dein.